Thank you, General Wood, and particularly I thank you in your researches about my background for only talking to my mother. It was very good of you. When General Wood said that this panel was going to be broad and far-reaching, I thought ran through my mind we could not have two better representatives of the Naval Sea Services in terms of thinking in broad and far-reaching ways. I'm not going to formally introduce them by going through each aspect of their careers, partly because that would be too time-consuming. But what I want to emphasize is, first, what an example they set in their friendship with each other. They both started at the Naval Academy in 1972, graduated in 1976, and were fast friends through that period, and hopefully they'll reflect some of that in the course of the panel, even as I try and generate dissent between them. Since 1976 and their graduation, they've really been multifaceted and I think terrific examples of what military officers do at their finest and in the fullest aspects of their careers. They've both been intellectually reflective to a remarkable degree. General Allen returned to the Naval Academy several times, including to the political science department there. He was commandant at the Naval Academy at the time of 9/11. He has an MA from Georgetown and 2 degrees at the graduate level from the National War College. He's an unusually reflective observer of the scene and now is at the Brookings Institution and also continues his service to the country as a critical advisor on security in the context of the Middle East. Admiral Stavridis in 1984 got a doctoral degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He's now returned there as the dean of the Fletcher School. He was recognized at the time of his studentship as the outstanding student, the Galleon Prize. And he's a prolific author of a wonderful series of books reflecting his experience in the field and his reflections on smart diplomacy and other things. These achievements also were paralleled by achievements for both of them in the Washington scene. Admiral Stavridis was military assistant, the executive assistant to Secretary of the Navy, to be exact, me. And a job for which I think he deserves at least a Purple Heart. He also was the executive assistant for Secretary Rumsfeld. I just don't know what measure of wounded recognition one should receive for that. He also went on from there to extraordinary service outside of Washington as the Southcom commander and concluding his career as SACEUR, very relevant because he had strategic oversight for Afghanistan to much of what we're going to talk about. General Allen has similarly been distinguished within the Pentagon. He was the military secretary to General Krulak as Commandant of the Marine Corps. He was also the Brigadier General in the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the area of Asia and Pacific Affairs, a topic we'll discuss and talk about some. And this aspect of activity in the Washington world, I think, is terribly important. It's in the field as well, though, that both these gentlemen distinguish themselves. It's General Allen winning at a young age the Leftwich Award as the Marine recognition of leadership in the field. Admiral Stavridis, the John Paul Jones Award for inspirational leadership. I can tell you that he's not only inspirational in his leadership in the field, but was inspirational as an executive assistant, and I think will be inspirational as a panelist. There are many other things that could be noted about these gentlemen. Eventually, General Allen rose to be the deputy and acting commander at CENTCOM and concluded his military career as the head of ISAF in Afghanistan, directly relevant to us today. I'd like to spend some time on other attributes, General Allen's achievements in the Council on Foreign Relations, being the first Marine term fellow, the work that both of them have done in a lot of realms. But I think you get the idea. These are two officers who together have combined to make our nation better And they've done it by service in Washington, service in the field, and by an unusual degree of reflection about what it means to be a military officer, what it means for a great power to exercise that power, and how we go about achieving American security. So having said all of that, I'm going to start by asking these two gentlemen how it is, if at all, that your Naval Academy training helped you as you undertook these efforts.
I remember 1972 like it was yesterday. Of course, it was 1.2 million years ago. But as I walked in the door at Annapolis, I literally bumped into John Allen. And he was so impressive and so clearly in the right place. And I remember thinking, wow, how am I going to fit in at this place? I think anybody looking at the Brigade of Midshipmen as it was constituted would have said, John Allen, going to be a general in the Marine Corps. And then they would have said, who's that short guy at the back end of the formation? John was a terrific friend throughout that period, and to answer your question of what's most important at Annapolis, I would say it's the friendships you form. And both pragmatically because of the networks that are achieved, being able to reach across cultures and communities and time, but also because of the friendship and the support that you get, both in good times and challenging times. So I would underline the friendship piece. And then I think for me, and John, I don't know if true for you as well, but for me, Annapolis taught me to manage my time. And so this ability to balance between work and family, between specific parts of the job, that ability to prioritize and put things in the right place, I think came out of my time at the Academy. So there's two things.
Jim, from a very early time in our career, was extraordinarily inspirational to me. I know we're not going to stand up here.
Sorry, can you all, I'm sorry, John, can you hear me back?
Okay. How about this?
I think maybe I should be lending you my mic.
We'll share
I got it.
Okay. Jim and I'll just push this back and forth. Well, there's the technology piece. I could shift to the Marine Corps technology solution, which is to yell, but we're going to go ahead and...
That's also the Marine Corps psychological solution.
Well,
right?
Yes, it is. Jim and I were very close friends from the very beginning, and I don't think, while he was very kind to talk about his impressions of me, every single member of my class knew that Jim was going to be not just a great leader of our naval service, but a great leader of our country at some point. And of course, I think that was certainly fulfilled in his time as SACEUR. The Academy for me was an enormously profound foundational experience for me. I was in a relatively new major at the time, operations analysis, and in an environment where you're still using a slide rule, operations analysis for a guy who wanted to be an English major was a real challenge. So the academics were a challenge for me the whole time I was at the Naval Academy, but the single thing I think that I take away from still those 4 years and why I felt comfortable going back a couple of times after that was when Jim and I were at the Naval Academy, the place was still full of veterans of World War II, the Korean War. Many of the company officers were fresh out of Vietnam, some of them, frankly, stashed at the Naval Academy to recover from wounds. So I think for me, as I look back upon the Academy experience, it was a whole experience, but it was an inspirational experience for me. I could walk down Stribling Walk or sit in a classroom with someone who had 200 air missions over North Vietnam, or someone who'd been a submariner on patrol in the Western Pacific during World War II. That kind of an experience inspired me very early in my career to seek to achieve every possible thing I could in terms of leadership. They were great inspirational leaders. So that institution, while it gave me a good technical background, I felt comfortable understanding the technical dimension of the naval service. What really helped me out of the Naval Academy was the inspirational, foundational development that I received from officers and professors who had spanned 3 wars and much of the modern formative history of our naval service.
So I like this very much, and let me suggest to you technical geniuses that you can take the mic out and you don't have to hand back and forth the stand. Maybe not. So much for my technical genius. My one suggestion, though, is that this is very believable and rings true and powerfully. But a skeptic would say, look, the world of World War II that you saw, John, and what you describe, was as far away from you in 1976 as 1976 is now from us. And that world has changed. And everything you learned in Naval Academy substantively looks at least dated. So how did you adjust to that changing world? And did the Naval Academy, in fact, hold you back in some ways?
Well, I think, again, the technical dimension of the education, many of those found the mathematical or scientific principles remain the same. You just get at them differently today. But what was so profound for me were those moments of personal experience where I learned about selfless sacrifice. Commander Gilmore on the USS Growler remains to me today something I learned at the Naval Academy, one of the most inspirational motivations for selfless leadership that I've ever seen. You know, he's badly wounded in close action with the Japanese. It looks like he may not be able to extract his submarine from having been rammed by a Japanese destroyer, and clears the bridge of the submarine to send all those on the bridge down to their safety so they could submerge the submarine underneath this Japanese destroyer. And they go up to get him when they realize he hasn't come down, and he gives one final command, which still is emblazoned in my heart, which was, take her down. He knew he'd never get down that hatch, and he sacrificed himself to save that submarine. That kind of selfless sacrifice, that kind of selfless leadership, that kind of leadership that put mission and troops ahead of self was what I learned at the Naval Academy. And I knew I would, over time, remain abreast of the science and the mathematics and the technical dimension, because it's part of who we are. But if I hadn't gotten that from there, I probably would have been a much less capable officer. And I will tell you that the selfless sacrifice I saw every single day in the Anbar province in Afghanistan, in Iraq, when I served there, among the Marines and the soldiers in Iraq, and then the selfless sacrifice I saw every single day from our magnificent, I mean magnificent troops in Afghanistan. I had a context where I could appreciate it. I loved those kids. It was a year ago, yesterday, I gave up command of Afghanistan after 19 months. And while we studied the acts of the greatest generation from World War II at the Naval Academy, I had the chance to serve with the new greatest generation on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. That academy experience gave me the basis ultimately to lead them.
Agreeing completely with John, and extremely well said. I'll pick up another theme that came out of the academy that I think you can drop a plumb line straight through to Afghanistan today, and that's collaboration. It's working with others. It's building coalitions and teams. This is something that is fundamental to graduating from the Naval Academy. The saying is collaborate to graduate. You need your network, your friends, your partners. That lesson for me was very profoundly applied both in my time at Southern Command and in my time as the Supreme Allied Commander at NATO, because the end, unilateral action is not a successful strategy for the United States. Now, there will be times where we need to act immediately, independently, and take immediate action. But in general, collaboration with international partners, collaboration in the interagency with our interagency partners, collaboration between private and public, that sense that no one of us, no one person, no one nation, no one alliance, no one of us is as smart as all of us working together. That came out of my time at the academy. And I think in the end, we won't deliver security strictly from the barrel of a gun. We're going to do it through building teams. And I think that was a second Annapolis lesson for me to put alongside John's.
So let's talk about Afghanistan concretely in that context. This panel is about the lessons of Afghanistan as well as larger life lessons. I see very vividly how much the two of you put into building those international collaborations and those interagency collaborations that you described, Jim. A very central thing that you also did was build the cooperation and collaboration with the in-country partner, the government of Afghanistan, the Afghan army, et cetera. That you were so central to training, John, and that you, Jim, were so involved with from your strategic perspective. How do you feel about that now in light of all the difficulties with Karzai and various other challenges in Afghanistan?
Well, let me pass the mic back to John about the internal piece. I think he's best positioned in that regard. I want to say a word about the coalition in Afghanistan. 50 countries have troops on the ground. You would have to go back to the Peloponnesian Wars to find a coalition of similar size. 28 NATO countries, 22 additional partners come from all around the world. At peak, over 150,000. Multinational command structure. This diplomatic and military coalition, alliance with a coalition built on top of it, was central to the work in Afghanistan. As John would tell you, and I'm going to hand him the mic in 1 second, a key coalition partner were the Afghans, the Afghan security forces. But Richard, Secretary Danzig raises the important point of some of the current difficulties. So with that as a setup, I'll pass the mic.
Just before you go, General Allen, I want to note for the record a remarkable and I think unprecedented event in Admiral Stavridis's very apt reference to the Peloponnesian Wars. We have now gone an unprecedented length of time, 23 minutes, without a reference to Greek history from Admiral Stavridis. That ended with that reference. John.
Well, I need to also use one word because if we're going to have a panel like this, someone has to say the word hegemony at some point. So I'll leave that out there and we'll come back to it if it's useful. Let me just echo Jim's comments about the coalition. Jim and I were raised in an environment, probably the first 20 years or so of our careers, where we were prepared either to fight the open ocean or the blue water battle against the Soviets, or to oppose the Soviets in the Fulda Gap. You know, something that was going to be a very high order naval or terrestrial battle. And if we ever wondered how well we were prepared to do that, I think Desert Shield and Desert Storm validated our abilities, what we learned at the National Training Center and ultimately the 29 Palms and our naval preparations and Navy preparations. When the time came to fight a Soviet-style army, fourth largest on the planet, 10 years having been fighting the Iranians, attributed through the media and many others as being more than 10 feet tall, they were crushed within 100 hours. So it gives you some sense of ultimately the totality of American power, military power, when it was finally applied. And yes, it was a coalition, but it was American military power which ultimately crushed the Iraqis. I think what we learned, though, in the 11th of September 2001 and ultimately in the war against Iraq, for me, I had to come to grips and come to face with the reality of the limits of American power. I hadn't had to grip that before. I hadn't had to confront the fact that the United States as a superpower, and in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the ultimate mega power, if you will, we'd never had the opportunity to, I think, confront the reality of the limitations of American power, which meant, to Jim's point, American or the global application of force is probably going to come in the form of a coalition henceforth. An hour after I took command in Afghanistan, I had all of my 3-star, 2-star, 1-star commanders and principal staff officers and senior civilians in a room where I gave them my commander's intent. And I started by talking about the center of gravity. The center of gravity of our campaign was in fact the coalition. 48 nations then, it would grow to 50. But how we ultimately nurtured the coalition, how we ultimately applied the strengths of each member of that coalition. Some people would concentrate on the caveats. I never worried about the caveats. I always monopolized on the strengths. How we held together the cohesion of that coalition, so would go the campaign. And that's going to have to be a lesson learned for all of us in the future. American military power might be applied unilaterally, but the reality is it's most judiciously applied and most effectively applied in the larger context of coalitions, and not just military coalitions, whole of governments with an S, whole of government application of military force. And so with Jim's leadership in NATO and with our continued effort to nurture a 50-nation coalition on the ground in Afghanistan, we really accomplished a great deal. And part of that, now to Jim's reason for passing me the mic, was to bring along the Afghans. And when I took command in Afghanistan, the intent was, as it always had been, to move the Afghan National Security Forces into the lead ultimately for conventional counterinsurgency operations, but also for policing. And by the time we departed, Jim and I both retired, that force was at the full wartime strength of 352,000. The administration had made the announcement of the intention to retain that force at that level out to 2018, which was a wise policy decision. And in 2012, Jim and I worked very closely on this. We shifted the main effort in Afghanistan from being ISAF forces in the lead, shaping the insurgency, keeping it out of the population centers, to moving the Afghans into the lead, and ultimately our becoming an advisory force. And so while the coalition was in fact the center of gravity, the main effort in achieving the campaign outcome would ultimately have to be the Afghan National Security Forces. Now, will they ever look like the United States Army? And the answer is no. But they are much better than they have been over the last decade. They are gaining in strength and cohesion and leadership capacity every single day. They moved into the lead for their first full operational fighting season in 2013. And by all accounts, while they did take casualties, they did in fact do quite well. And I am confident that if we remain over the long term in Afghanistan, we can continue the process of advising and supporting them and ultimately provide the security platform necessary for the post-2014 period.
I think John's absolutely laid out the military trajectory. I want to pick up on the interagency, whole of government and private-public piece in Afghanistan, because I think they're critical to this. Let me give you some numbers. When the Taliban ran Afghanistan, there were perhaps 500,000 boys in school. Today, 10 years later, there are 9 million children in school. 40% of them are little girls. 10 years ago, there was health care available to 10% of the population. Today, 65%. 10 years ago, life expectancy in Afghanistan was 42. Today, it's 62. The United Nations, which tracks this, has never seen a jump like this. Cell phones under the Taliban, 0. 10 years later, today, 19 million cell phones on an adult population of about 14 or 15 million. Now, that could be a good or a bad thing, I suppose. But this is a society that is moving, and the reason for that is the interagency piece of this. That's a whole separate coalition, a coalition of USAID and their counterparts around the world, coalitions of the amazing 400 NGO and humanitarian organizations that operate in Afghanistan. This is the deep coalition. In the end, I think this will be central to how the narrative of Afghanistan comes out. And I think, like John, I'm cautiously optimistic because of all that, recognizing the challenges, the narcotics, the corruption, the difficulties with the current president, and so forth. But the vectors over 10 years are in the right direction. So often we look at Afghanistan like it's a photograph. You have to look at it like it's a movie. And where was it? And where's the change? And that's roughly in the right direction.
So it seems to me to be an extraordinary achievement that you both played central roles in to get to the point that you describe. I think you, John, rightly described the character of the Afghan military, and you, Jim, the nature of the coalitional effort that was put together and the transformation of society. But connected to this is a part that both of you perhaps studiously haven't talked about, which is the character of the government that we rely on in this context, and for that matter, the character of our own government. And you conclude, General Allen, by saying that you have some confidence in the ability of the Afghan force to continue if we remain present. So how do you feel about those two governments and the staying power of your creation, given the difficulties both have in being potentially up to the task?
Well, we know that the campaign had envisioned from the very beginning that there would be a residual force. Foreign forces never enter into a counterinsurgency campaign on behalf of a host nation without trying to do several things. The first is the conventional forces of the interventionary force will shape the insurgency, try to keep it out of the population centers, beat it down, shape the insurgency to do the next really important thing, which is to prepare the indigenous force ultimately to become the preeminent platform for security, to replace the foreign forces in country. And that's what we did a great deal of the time over the last 3 years. The shift in momentum from us in the lead to the Afghans in the lead began in 12. It was fulfilled in 13, and the momentum still continues to shift on behalf of the Afghan National Security Forces. The third thing is to build capacity, and you have to build capacity across not just the institutions of security, but you have to build capacity across institutions of government. And that's different than nation building because you simply can't afford the nation building bill, but you can, in fact, by carefully locating those areas that need to have capacity within the existing government and building capacity there, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Mines, those key areas that will ultimately seek to define or will help to define the future of Afghanistan, build capacity there. Now, this goes to the point that Jim made, which is the whole of government approach, the interagency approach and the international approach is really important to this outcome. And I would make the general, it's always a problem when you make a general comment, I would make the general comment that without security, almost nothing is possible in the future in Afghanistan. With security, almost anything is possible. And we haven't completed the process of building capacity either with the security forces or in the government of Afghanistan. And that process, in partnership with the international community, still needs to progress. We have an election coming up on the 5th of April, relatively soon. Virtually all of the candidates are pro-Western, pro-American. We have great confidence that whoever will win, whoever wins, will seek to have a constructive relationship with the United States. But we need to keep our eyes open. We need to be mindful of the fact that, well, this war began with Afghanistan being the 4th poorest country on the planet. Afghanistan will still be one of the poorest countries on the planet. And so we need to keep our expectations measured. We need to continue the process of building security forces. So in the post-Karzai era, that first elected government can get its legs up under it, establish itself as the elected government of the Afghan people, and ultimately create the capacity necessary to govern Afghanistan through this thing called the Decade of Transformation, which under Jim's leadership and the other political leadership in Europe designated as the period of 15 to 25, this decade of foreign direct investment that can help Afghanistan stabilize its economy. So that's really important. For us, the United States needs to be clear about what that investment, what that post-2014 security environment will be. And I know there has been a great deal of analysis put into this. I provided my numbers, I provided my analysis. The longer we take in announcing what those numbers are, the more that the actors in the process will continue to hedge. But I think we'll see that announcement relatively soon, and if the number that I've heard is the number that we announce, I still think that there is significant work that we can do constructively to continue the professionalization of the Afghan security forces with our partners and with NATO, that provides that credible platform ultimately for governance and the economy to achieve equilibrium and begin to move into that decade of transformation.
Jim, go ahead if you want.
Okay.
But I just want to press General Allen on a couple of those points, but if you want to go first, go ahead.
Okay. I want to pick a specific point, which is I think John and I are both on the record. I know I am. I think the number needs to be about 10,000 U.S. and about 5,000 to 6,000 coalition troops. I think that's easily attainable, easily sustainable. And I'm very hopeful that's where it comes out, because I think that's the baseline. It's the rebar in the concrete that I think the Afghans will need in order for this project to come out successfully. Second point I want to pick up on, John very correctly mentioned an important ministry in Afghanistan, which is the Ministry of Mines. Afghanistan sits on somewhere between $1 to $3 trillion worth of cobalt, copper, nickel, manganese, gold, iron, and lithium, which, if you haven't checked under the hood in your electric car lately, is part of the battery structure, which will probably be a prime mover in a lot of global transportation grids, along with rare earths. So there is potential for a mineral-based economy for Afghanistan. The trick, as John alludes to, is getting from here to there and weaning the economy both off the international contributions as well as the narcotic piece of it, the heroin and opium, which are significant challenges. So just to make those two specific points, and then you wanted to press John about something.
Yeah, but actually, you make me want to press you too. I hear you, and when I look at the part of the glass that's full, I just am immensely impressed with the achievement. But how do you address how do you respond to the critic who says, let's just focus on the Afghan government for a moment, the host nation government. This government is corrupt. It has been, it will continue to be. It is not notably less corrupt than when we started, as we've infused some $9 billion of assistance into a $10 billion economy. Much of it is like pouring resources through into a bucket with many holes on the bottom. Moreover, this society is tribal. The vision of governance in Kabul and a strong national state is a Western vision that will not apply. The divisions in this society will inevitably force the periphery to be stronger than the center, and we will wind up with a variety of compromises throughout that periphery. So the vision that is constructed is not viable because this key part of it, the host nation state structure, is not viable. It isn't Karzai as a personality, it's this societal structural point. So how do you two feel about that?
Well, first I would say, in terms of corruption, there's plenty of corruption to go around globally. And we can look at any number of societies who manifest this. This is a long-term human project to work our way out of. Are the Afghans making some progress? I think very slight, but discernible slight progress. But I think that's part of the glass half empty calculus, no question. In terms of, are there examples we can look at where this prescription that John and I are talking about has worked? I would look back at Colombia 10 years ago. I'd look at the Balkans 15 years ago. If you want to really look back at Europe and Japan coming out of the Second World War. All of the things we're talking about were applied in those societies, and in all of those cases, you heard many of these same deep-rooted and legitimate concerns in Afghanistan. When I roll all that together, Richard, I come out that we have a better than even chance of success in Afghanistan, maybe 2 and 3. Now that's far from a slam dunk, but I think that's a realistic calculus when you put it all together. In terms of the governance, as I look at the candidates who are mentioned prominently, Abdullah Abdullah, who was the runner-up last time, Ashraf Ghani, Western-trained economist, and those are the two leading candidates at the moment. I think we'll trade up with a new administration in Kabul. I think the fact that we're handing off power democratically is, on the one hand, remarkable, and on the other hand, a testament to the the potential for further progress in Afghanistan. John?
I think we will always experience the influence of both the ethnic differences in Afghanistan and the tribal differences. It's inescapable in that culture. But it doesn't, in and of itself, preclude a system of governance that will work for the Afghans. You know, we've talked about the four corners approach to Afghanistan, the 1,000-year history of Afghanistan that has led from Kabul, but governed through the four corners, which is Mazar-i-Sharif in the north, Jalalabad in the east, Kandahar in the south, and Herat in the west. I have no reason to believe that it won't necessarily be the same in the aftermath. So the question isn't whether tribalism and ethnicity ultimately overwhelms a system of government that Afghanistan seems to be moving towards. I think the question is, can we create an equilibrium between the inherent history of how Afghanistan is most effectively governed and the center, and what we can do to continue to build effectiveness and efficiency in ministries that will ultimately create some form of permanence in a system of government that we can recognize will work in Afghanistan. There's a new kind of Afghan who's out there today. He or she will recognize that they are a Pashtun, or they're a Tajik, or they're a Hazara. They will recognize that. But now in a way that we didn't see even when we invaded Afghanistan in the fall and the winter of 2001, they see themselves now proudly as an Afghan. Just a very quick story. I went to Shindan, which is in the west, which is where the air training center is for the Afghan Air Force. And I, not probably very wisely, decided that I would give one of their young instructor pilots an opportunity to teach me on the simulator that they had. So I got in the right seat, the pilot was in the left seat, and tried to coach me through shooting several approaches to the airfield at Shindan, a day approach, a night approach, approach under snow, and of course, I crashed every single time. And at the end of the experiment, the instructor pilot, she said to me in perfect, unaccented English, "Sir, it's a very good thing that you ended up as an infantryman." Now, we couldn't have imagined an instructor pilot speaking perfect English as a female 10 years ago. It wouldn't have even been possible before that. Now, there were females in the Soviet-era Afghan Air Force, but this young officer was an officer in every way we would recognize an officer today. She was professional. She knew her stuff behind the stick. She really was a great pilot. And those are the kinds of people that we're seeing emerging from a system of education in Afghanistan today that Jim talked about, where they're being educated in a credible manner to make them participatory and credible citizens in Afghanistan. So, you know, this experiment is long from over, but the accomplishments that have been made and the fact that the Afghan National Security Forces may, in fact, become the platform and the shield for this experiment to continue, I think, as Jim said, I think it's better than 50%. We learned 3 hard lessons, though, at the end of the Soviet era. 3 hard lessons. The Soviets produced a pretty good Afghan force, and they fought the Mujahideen, who we supported. They fought them pretty well. And as the Soviet Union began to collapse, the first thing that happened was they took home their advisors. Now, the Afghans continued to fight, and they were pretty effective fighting, even with the advisors home, although we believe that advisors really provide that steel in the backbone that creates battlefield operational success. But it was when the Soviet Union ultimately fully collapsed and the funding withdrew and the resources dried up and the Afghans ultimately couldn't pay each other and couldn't put food on the table that the military, as was said to me once, stumbled along, collapsed along tribal lines and fragmented, and which contributed directly to the civil war and the rise of the Taliban and so on. I said there were 3 lessons. So the first lesson is advisors will make a difference in the continued professionalization of the Afghan forces. And resources will make a difference in continuing to resource putting food on the table, putting money in the pocket of the troops, and putting right kinds of equipment in their hands. And then the third lesson we learned is when we precipitously pulled out of the region, it created a catastrophe in the region, frankly. And so our continued presence, not just the U.S., the Western continued presence, works to the long-term stability of Afghanistan. It provides confidence to the Pakistanis that they can be participants in the peace process. It eases the Cold War tension between Pakistan and Afghanistan because, Pakistan and India, because the Pakistanis don't need to worry about the Indians being a major influence or a player in a chaotic outcome in Afghanistan in their strategic rear. There's all kinds of reasons why we should be paying close attention to those three lessons learned. And while we won't necessarily apply the remedies exactly as they might have been applied, there are very important lessons to be learned, not just for Afghanistan, but in the aftermath of another environment like this, where we seek to create a capability within a country that has been beset by an insurgency.
Just to build on that, I think the worst lesson we could draw from Afghanistan is that of isolationism. And let's be blunt, there's enormous fatigue in our country for this kind of operation stemming from Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think the public tends to conflate it all. It's Iraqis and it's Afghans and it's Palestinians and it's Israelis and it's Sunnis and Shia, and it's just this enormous disastrous crescent of crisis that runs across the North Africa through the Levant to Central Asia. We have to stay engaged. It is frustrating, it is hard, we have to pick our battles, but if we do the kinds of things we've talked about today, the international, interagency, private-public, and the one thing we haven't talked about today is strategic communication. It's gaining the narrative, and we have a pretty good story to tell. What's our story? It's freedom of speech, freedom of religion, liberty, democracy, gender equality, racial equality. That's a pretty good story. And we've got to maintain a belief in those values. We need to communicate them. We need to do it with partners. But the worst thing we could do, in my view, is to walk away from this turbulent part of the world, or indeed take the lesson that we should come home to our shores. That would be an enormous mistake, and I feel that idea blowing in the intellectual wind at the moment, and it worries me.
I'm sorry, John, did you?
I'll just put one other point. Jim ticked off some really important accomplishments that have emerged as a direct result of the Western presence and the long-term engagement by the United States and our Western partners and the conflict. One of the most important, that is really important today in Afghanistan, is the emergence of a free press, much to the chagrin of President Karzai on a regular basis. But there has been an enormous turnaround in opportunity for a young class of Afghan women and men who are now reporters, who are writing openly, who are writing critically. And so I think a free and open press in the context of what's possible in Afghanistan is another real example of what can happen in a country that just 11 or 12 years ago, we had no women even in school, and they had no chance of going to school and no chance of being part of the government. There are so many women in the elected jirga in the parliament now who are key players. The role of women in society. No society has ever emerged as from a conflict into a post-conflict or a developing society that has been able to do that without bringing its women into the mainstream. And there is a lot of movement in that regard in Afghanistan. A lot more needs to be done. We're all worried about the future of women in Afghanistan, but women organized in civil society is occurring at a level we could never even have imagined on the 10th of September 2001. So there are a lot of huge accomplishments that have occurred on the back of this conflict. You have to ask yourself, will those be sustained if the United States departs, if the West departs, and ultimately leaves this unfinished experiment unfinished as it is today?
So we're going to open this in a few minutes to questions from the floor, but before doing that, I wanted to ask the two of you if we could widen the frame a little bit and think about some other areas of the world which are beset by tensions or crisis. What are the lessons of Afghanistan in your mind for example, the tensions with China over the air defense zone and the Senkakus generally, or the issues in Syria that are so messy to grapple with? I don't think you're going to want to comment about the Middle East more broadly and Palestinian issues, General Allen, but if you want to, I'm only too delighted. I know you're here in your Brookings capacity, not your State Department capacity. But my question for the two of you most broadly is, can you extrapolate from what you've said to those contexts?
Sure. I'll hit one in Africa, and then John, who's an expert in Asia, might want to comment on perhaps some of the Asian aspects. How many people have seen the movie Captain Phillips? I bet a lot, particularly with this audience. It's a terrific film. You ought to be asking yourself, when you look at a movie like that, why would young Somalis want to get on tiny skiffs, load up with rusty AK-47s, and go out and try and take down big tankers? Part of the reason is because there's a huge pot of gold payout on the 1 and 2 instances where they succeed, but more often, vastly more often than not, they end up killed, captured, etc. So the question is, look at the east coast of Africa, at Somalia, Somaliland, Puntland, and the region around there. The conditions on the ground are so disaffecting that young men are willing to take the kinds of chances you saw in Captain Phillips. To solve that kind of process is classically prescribed by what we've tried to do in Afghanistan. It's coming ashore. We won't solve piracy at sea. We can be palliative. We can be somewhat responding to an attack. But to solve the piracy problems, you need to go ashore. You need international work. You need interagency. You need this deep coalition that addresses the kinds of issues that send young men to sea, as was the case in Captain Phillips, ultimately to their deaths. So I have no particular sympathy for pirates, but it's important that we understand why it's happening and apply some of these ideas, and I think they're extremely germane in that part of the world as one example.
Well, I think the acting deputy secretary made some very good comments this morning about however you articulate on a particular day the policy of the rebalance to Asia. Sometimes it's called the pivot, sometimes it's reestablishing the equilibrium, whatever it might be. The United States faces some real challenges today, and it goes to the point that Jim made, which is that the world is a more stable place with the United States engaged, as opposed to the United States not engaged. And in those areas where we have not become engaged, or where our engagement has diminished, we probably find that there has been either an increase of instability, or we're on the verge of an increase in instability. Now, the challenge for us in the months and years ahead is to balance a decreasing resource availability and a resource pot with still significant international engagement requirements as we understand them. That doesn't mean we have to be everywhere all the time, but our ability to engage on our terms at the right moment is still going to be critical ultimately to U.S. strategic interests overseas in many areas and in many ways. And so as we seek to address the issue of the rebalance to Asia, we will still have really significant requirements for us to remain engaged in the Middle East, in particular in the Gulf, where we have cultivated very deep friendships and relationships over a long period of time. We have a glimmer of hope potentially with Iran, but I'd be very careful. Bob Gates once said he spent 30 years looking for the moderate Iranian. I'm not sure yet that we have found the moderate Iranian, but the interim agreement on their enrichment, I think, is encouraging, and we'll let that play out for a bit. Nonetheless, there's still a requirement for a substantial U.S. engagement and presence in that region. At the same time, as we talk about the rebalance to Asia, what does that mean for our Asian partners? Now, Asia is a unique region. We have 5 bilateral security arrangements in East Asia with some very, very good old partners with whom we have very strong economic, societal, governmental, diplomatic, and military ties. We've been gone in many respects from Asia for a while. We had to fight 2 wars in 2 very different, distant areas. And the intent of rebalancing in Asia, and I'll talk in a security context, has been to provide, I think, greater certainty to our partners in Asia that the presence of the United States military, and in particular naval forces, it is a maritime theater, seeks to enhance stability, not create provocation. I think it's been a very long time since there has been a conflict in Asia. And in many respects, that absence of conflict has been a result of the presence of the U.S. and other militaries across the entire spectrum of the military, from simple presence all the way to the highest, most intense aspect of our warfighting capabilities. And that's created stability. Now, there's constant concern about China, and every year about the time the Department of Defense issues its China Military Power Report, there's a lot of questioning about whether China is a threat to the United States or not. Now, I spent a good bit of time a few years ago on East Asian portfolios, and in particular spent a lot of time watching the emergence of China. And I frankly am an advocate for a constructive relationship with China. Our economies are inextricably linked. Our peoples have a long-term, ancient relationship, ancient by virtue of the United States in terms of how old we are. And we find ourselves in competition with respect to business and our economies, and sometimes, not sometimes, we always have difficulty with the Chinese over issues of human rights. But the relationship with China is not and does not need to be inextricably tied to some form of confrontation, ultimately even a military confrontation. Yet the question becomes each year, is China a growing threat to the United States and to our interests in the West? And I don't think it has to be. I don't think it needs to be. But when I was a young intelligence officer years ago, the term threat was expressed in a mathematical equation which said threat equals capability plus intentions. And the Chinese, of course, have pursued a double-digit military expansion for a decade now, and it's accumulating quite a military capacity. The issue isn't whether it has the military capacity, the issue is whether the Chinese may have an intention, ultimately to use that military capability in a threatening manner. And frankly, while you'll hear within the PLA and within the Chinese military talk about the United States as the potential threat to China, a term that we don't, in our own way, use with respect to China in reciprocity, the recent air defense zone, the ADIZ, as a unilateral act, I think is beginning to cause a real problem. I think that unilateral act has caused a lot of concern in the region with partners of ours. It could be called provocative. It depends on whether they ultimately choose to enforce the conditions of the ADIZ. But when you make that kind of an investment in your military capacity and unilaterally create that enormous portion of the Pacific Ocean, which requires a by your leave by the states seeking to transit, you have to ask, what is it that is at the heart of that policy, and how will the international community react to that? I think the U.S. policy was exactly right, which is basically to ignore it. And if we permit large segments of Asia, ultimately, to be dominated unilaterally by a particular power, then I think we'll seek to see, or we will see, an increase in instability over the long term. That's why the rebalance is really important. It's not just a rebalance in the military, it's a rebalance politically, diplomatically, economically, but also in terms of the traditional presence of the United States military, which, by the way, was of great assistance to the Chinese over time by the stability it created for the development of the Chinese economy and Chinese capacity. So it works to everyone's interests. It's not a provocative military buildup in the context of it's being targeted against someone. It's a buildup that ultimately creates opportunities for stability. But provocative acts ultimately can create instability, which may require some form of a response. And part of that response is, I think, the arming of Japan and the conversation more and more among the Japanese about whether they need to ultimately take unilateral action to build more military capability, ultimately over the Shinkaku Islands and other disputed territories. So we need to continue to remain closely engaged with the Chinese. The relationship is not irrevocably sent on a trajectory towards military confrontation, but we also need in every possible way to build the kind of environment, military, diplomatic, military environment that can dissuade elements within East Asia from those kinds of unilateral acts that create instability. And the ADIZ, I think, was nearly a provocative act.
So it's clear that we have the potential to open up whole other topics and whole other panels here. I want to instead open this to the audience. I just want to make two observations of my own, if I can. Jim, do you want 30 seconds? Is that what's here?
I would just, I was going to say, if you're ready for some good news, again, look at where Colombia was 10 years ago, and U.S. engagement, along with the work of the Colombian people, have essentially reversed a nation in extreme geopolitical decline, and the Balkans, where 15 years ago, 8,000 men and boys were killed at Srebrenica, million people pushed across borders, 100,000 killed. Sounds a lot like Syria today. Yet the application of a lot of the ideas we've been discussed have really turned that situation around as well. So I simply wanted to add a little balance to the litany of despair that we've provided here this morning.
I don't see it as a litany of despair, but the point I wanted to make first is that I, as I hope is evident, have immense admiration for the achievements the two of you effected in Afghanistan, not to mention elsewhere in the course of your careers. And I think you're quite right, Jim, in focusing us on Africa and the potential for doing similar things there, indeed the need. The question that I think is worth thinking about is whether the achievement is, A, sustainable, and that obviously arises in the context of Afghanistan particularly, but second, whether it's scalable, whether, yes, when we do it with men of your quality and women of your quality, but in one particular place with this immense Herculean effort, whether we in fact can do it in many places, and when we do it with less than Herculean effort, what it results in. I merely put that on the table. The second point I just wanted to make ties back to my introduction of these two admirable warriors. You can start by thinking of these men in the field as warriors. I first met Admiral Stavridis when he was a captain on the Barry. He went on, among other things, to lead the Enterprise Carrier Strike Group. We haven't even mentioned General Allen's achievements in Iraq in 2004 to 2006 in Al-Anbar. Alone, these achievements, this ability, would make a career. But what's so striking to me is when we start to talk about these topics in the context of Afghanistan, you immediately see how relevant their policy time and their time of reflection and study is. I tweaked Admiral Stavridis about the Peloponnesian reference, but the reality is that his views of this are deeply grounded in a sense about history. And when General Allen starts to talk about Afghanistan, he has to talk about the culture, the history, the tribal tensions, et cetera. And for me, a message that underlies all of this achievement is that this kind of study, reflection, and policy engagement is not some additional layer on top of the warfighting ability. It's inextricably intertwined. And there is a resistance within the military establishment to recognizing these other achievements and recognizing that intertwining. And if we're really going to be strong in the world that they're describing, we need more people like them, which means providing more of that kind of training. But having said that, let's open the floor to discussion, and I think we've got some questions from the texting.
We do, sir. Thank you. First question, what, if any, innovations have our adversary used to strategic effect in Afghanistan, and what innovation or technological improvement would you desire the most to be successful in Afghanistan?
I'll give you two innovations in Afghanistan that I thought were quite successful. One was literacy training to the Afghan security forces. The vast majority of them enter the military unable to read and write. Why? Because the Taliban withheld education from their demographic. A private-public effort between ISAF forces, contractors, NGOs was involved in providing literacy training. Gets mixed results, obviously, but in broad strokes, we have probably brought 300,000 plus Afghans to a basic level of literacy. Now that's a very innovative way to help try and create security. Second one is using cell phones to pay Afghan security forces, thus reducing corruption, taking big stacks of Afghan money out of the equation, which can be skimmed off easily, and helping the Afghans shift their economy from a paper-based bricks and mortar banking system to a fairly high-tech cell phone-based system, I think is the type of innovation that I think is fairly positive. John?
You can comment, but you don't have to if you want to take another question.
Could you repeat the question one more time, please?
What, if any, innovations have our adversary used to strategic effect in Afghanistan? Right. And what innovation or technological improvement would you desire the most to be successful in Afghanistan?
Good. Two things from my perspective on my time on the ground. The first was that while we had encountered this crisis in Afghanistan, in Iraq, it really came to a head in Afghanistan. That was the IED. The IED was a major problem for us across the spectrum of operations in Afghanistan. But I have to tell you that the work of JIADO, much of the industry, probably which is present here today, there are thousands of U.S. and coalition troops alive today, some of whom were wounded but are still alive today as a direct result of the work of JIADO to eliminate the advantage of the Taliban and others in installing IEDs across the theater. The other innovation, and you need to just stay with me on this, the other innovation which we had not encountered in large measure in Iraq or in previous wars was the innovation of the insider attack, which for me as the commander in Afghanistan created the greatest political crisis that I had, which was where we as advisors were seeking to advise Afghan police and soldiers who were killing our advisors. That created a huge political crisis. Remember, I said to my commanders that the center of gravity of the campaign was the coalition. And as coalition members were having their advisors assassinated, murdered by the people we were advising, this began to create a dissolution, frankly, of the coalition. It was, to me, the largest, well, I had a lot of political challenges. This was the biggest political challenge I faced because there were elements in the coalition ready to say, this is it, we're done. And in fact, one major troop contributing nation did pull all of its operational forces out of Afghanistan early. And so the innovation of the insider attack was a real political crisis for us, and it took certain technological, intelligence, organizational approaches necessary to get at it. But if we were going to do this again, one of the first things that I would seek to do is ensure that we took all measures necessary to anticipate the direct attack on our advisors and our troops to protect them from the very beginning. It took us a while to recognize the strategic implications of the insider attack, but when it finally exploded in our faces in the summer of 2012, we had to get after it because I thought that the cohesion of the coalition was at risk. Great question.
It is a good question. Let's have the next one.
You have spoken about interagency lessons. Could you please speak to coalition lessons we keep relearning and new lessons about this center of gravity which we confront in today's economic and information environments?
I'll give 3 or 4, and John will probably have a couple others. I think first of all is transparency. It's sharing as much information and intelligence as you can, and this gets controversial. And also in a big coalition, there are going to be partners who get more of the intel than others. The degree to which you can reduce that is very important. Secondly is respect for other cultures, languages, and histories, knowing that certain nations will be very good at, say, intelligence gathering or aviation. Other nations will be very good at road clearance and mine clearance. understanding what nations have in their kit bag that you can bring to the table. Number three, John just alluded to it, understanding there's a political dimension that has to be managed, and that requires both people in uniform as well as political leadership, obviously, to engage at the political level. In the case of this coalition in Afghanistan, that means Brussels. I spent a vast majority of my Afghan effort was in Brussels, in capitals, in Europe and around the world, convincing the political leadership that we could accomplish the mission. And then a fourth thing I'll say that's critical in coalition management is strategic communication, making sure that there's recognition of the partners, that they feel part of the effort, that their efforts are recognized in your media, in your campaigns, in your social networks, and so forth.
Jim nailed it. I couldn't add any more. I'll just tell a very brief, quick story. I would go out of my way to stop whatever I was doing to meet with the chiefs of defense or the minister of defense of any country passing through Afghanistan that was part of the coalition, whether they had 6 troops, some had only 6 troops, or whether they had 60,000 troops. I felt a personal responsibility to help to nurture the coalition. And where it came home to me one day, 2 points, where it came home to me was the Minister of Defense of a young, but it was a small contribution, but a young nation, and they were giving per capita nearly one of the largest proportionate contributions of troops to the war. And with tears in his eyes, he said, until the Soviet Union collapsed and they achieved their freedom, he said, for most of our modern history, we have been consumers of freedom. Now we want to be providers of freedom. That's the first point. So there was a massive acceleration, I think, of political development as a result of this conflict that we would never have seen otherwise as a result of this coalition. And the second point was, if I've had one, I've had 20 chiefs of defense tell me that they could never have achieved the level of professionalization within their military if it hadn't been for the opportunity for 11 or 12 years to work very closely with the magnificent troops of the United States military every single day to build up to and including a level of interoperability that they could never have even imagined absent this opportunity. Now, wars are all about horrible things, and typically wars are ugly things. But coming out of this conflict, the political acceleration and the military acceleration that many of these countries have achieved as a direct result of its interaction with us and interaction with each other, we could not have imagined. And I think this will go a very long way towards better interoperability, better political stability, better relations governmentally from state to state as a direct result of this. And I don't think yet we can even imagine the benefit that that will be to us 20, 30, 40 years from now.
Let's squeeze in another question.
You have mentioned several examples of past successful nation-building experiences. Iraq was not mentioned as a success. What can be done today to make sure our tremendous investment in Iraq pays off over time?
John?
We thought we'd end with an easy one.
Yeah, I'm somewhere between. It's a too hard answer with 2 minutes, and I'm going to pass on it because look, the hardest time I ever had in my life leading troops was in the Anbar province, fighting Al-Qaeda. And frankly, we were successful in that province. And if Dave Petraeus were sitting here today, he would tell you that the process that started in the Anbar province with the Sahwa al-Iraq, the awakening of the tribes, spread across the country, and it ultimately, fundamentally and profoundly changed the direction that war was headed. And we pulled out. It was a policy decision to pull out. I'm not going to question the policy decision. That's another panel, another discussion at some point. But the stability which ultimately had been created between the three principal elements of the Iraqi population, the Shia element, the Sunni element, and the Kurdish element, it wasn't sufficient in the end, ultimately, to create the long-term stability that we needed. And I think that has, it's now playing out. with internal instability that's occurring in Iraq, but it's not in and of itself a failure of Maliki. It's not in and of itself a failure of the U.S. effort, because the problems out of Syria are bleeding over in a very big way, and frankly, for those of us who fought in Anbar, to see al-Qaeda banners flying over parts of Fallujah just gives you a very unique feeling.
I'll just pick up on what could we do about it, which I think number one is to stay engaged, not to throw up our hands at the despair and the tragedy of it all, and continue to be engaged. And I think the international ability to do that using NATO for a training mission in Iraq, for example, exchanging advisors, working this in the military context but internationalizing it to the degree we can is crucial. Secondly, private sector has a big role to play here. The engagement of many of these companies in selling weapon systems is a very positive way to keep Iraq moving forward. And I'm very hopeful that not only because it's good for American business, but good for the geopolitical context, we'll continue to do that. And then thirdly, it's not just the military instruments, as we've talked about today. So much of this has to do with understanding Iraqi culture and history and working with them. At the Fletcher School, where I'm now the dean, we've got a whole group of senior Iraqi educators and former policymakers coming at the end of the month to have a conversation, to continue to build these kind of second-order track 2 linkages. So like the Robert Redford movie, I'll say all is not lost. I think that if we use the tools we have, we've got a reasonable chance of keeping Iraq where it needs to be, a friend to the United States, engaged in the region. Unbelievably challenging, and I fully validate the feelings of folks like John who spent significant time on the ground there.
Well, whatever might be said about our departure from Iraq, it's time for this panel to depart. I leave the thought that I very much hope, I think everybody in this room hopes, that in some ways the Academy class of 2014 is producing graduates like these two. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well,